Hey, war relic, did you actually fight? Or do you just like showing off that dusty old hat? The question cracked through the cafe like a bottle shattering on tile. The old man in the corner didn't flinch. He just tightened his grip on the coffee cup, then slowly placed one hand over his chest right where a piece of shrapnel had once nearly ended him. No one knew who he was. Not yet. But then the owner walked in, and everything changed. Welcome to Grateful Stories, where tales of compassion and kindness are told. Let's uncover what really happened. The place smelled of fresh grounds and maple syrup. Sunlight spilled through the front windows, catching steam from cups that hadn't been sipped yet. People chatted quietly, their voices low against the backdrop of jazz playing from the overhead speakers. Frank Delaney walked in like he always did alone, steady and dressed with quiet intention. At 78, he wore his age with the same kind of dignity. He wore his old USMC cap, faded but unshaken. The stitching on it was threadbare, the emblem dulled from time, but unmistakable. He made his way to the small round table near the corner window. That table had become his, not by claim, but by rhythm. He placed his cap down gently, as if it still held the weight of years. Then he reached for the sugar, hands trembling just enough to make the packet crinkle before it opened. 3 young men sat across the room, loud enough to make the place feel smaller. Early 20s, maybe mid-20s button-ups half-tucked, eyes locked to their phones. One of them nudged the other, leaning in with a smirk. "Hey," he said, not bothering to lower his voice, "check out the old guy. Cosplaying a Marine." The one with the sharp fade and expensive sneakers leaned back in his chair and turned toward Frank. His name was Jake. "Nice hat." "Old man," Jake called out. "You picked that up at a thrift store or what?" Laughter followed sharp and hollow. One of the others raised his phone, snapped a picture without asking, and tapped away at his laptop. Maybe it was a post, maybe just a private joke. Either way, the tone of the cafe shifted just slightly, but enough. Frank didn't look at them. He stirred his coffee twice, then twice again. His eyes stayed fixed on the window, where the morning light filtered through like stained glass. But his fingers wrapped tighter around the cup. And then, slowly, one hand drifted to his chest where beneath the fabric, a web of old scar tissue still pulled when he breathed too deeply. Jake wasn't done. He pushed his chair back just a little, voice lifting like a dare. "So, old-timer, did you actually see combat? Or you just like the costume?" A woman near the bar glanced over, frowning slightly. The couple seated in the far booth stopped mid-conversation. Nobody said a word. Frank blinked once, calmly. Then he reached for his coffee again. The door chimed. Gordon Reyes stepped in carrying a brown paper bag in one hand and a clipboard under his arm. He wore a black polo and an apron still dusted with flour. His face was flush from the morning run to the bakery down the street. He paused just inside the doorway. The tension was immediate, unspoken but unmistakable. His eyes scanned the room flanked by the window. The 3 young men, the frozen expressions of half a dozen loyal customers. Gordon set the bag behind the counter without a word. He walked straight over, his shoes made soft, deliberate sounds against the tile. He didn't raise his voice when he stopped at Jake's table. "Who's been talking to Mr. Delaney?" he asked. Jake smirked, half defiant. "We're just asking questions," he shrugged. "I mean, not every guy with a military hat actually served." "Right, could be anyone." Gordon didn't blink. His voice stayed level. "You're right. Not everyone who wears one served." But Frank did. He looked toward the corner table. Vietnam, 1968, Hue City. He inhaled burning debris for 7 hours straight, trying to pull his team through collapsed alleyways. Doctors told him he'd never walk right again. He still showed up for 3 more tours. Jake chuckled. "Sounds like a good story. You sure he didn't make it up?" Frank moved before Gordon could speak again. The old man placed his cup gently on the table and stood. His legs were slower than they used to be, but they were steady. He picked up his cap not to wear it, but to hold it at waist height. Then, very slowly, he turned toward Jake. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "You don't need to believe me," he said, looking straight at him. "But you don't talk about the dead like they never mattered." The words sat in the air, heavier than anything Jake had expected. No one laughed. From the far side of the room, a man in his 50s muttered under his breath, "That's enough." Someone near the espresso machine nodded, lips pressed tight. Gordon took a slow breath. "This place," he said, gesturing around, "doesn't welcome disrespect. You don't have to order, but you're not going to sit here and mock a man who bled for this country." Jake pushed back his chair. "Man, we didn't mean anything. It's just go," Gordon said flatly. Now, the other two stood first, clearly uncomfortable. Jake lingered, but the silence had grown teeth. He muttered something under his breath, then followed his friends out the door. The cafe stayed quiet even after the bell above the door jingled again. Gordon didn't move right away. He turned toward Frank, his eyes softer now. Frank nodded once, nothing more. Behind the counter, the barista set down a clean mug beside the sink, hands shaking slightly. The jazz still played, but now it sounded like it belonged to another day. And by the window, sunlight traced the edge of a well-worn cap resting between sips of something stronger than coffee. Gordon Reyes had seen enough bar fights and college debates to recognize the shape of tension. It had corners. And that morning, Awasho had curled around the corner table like barbed wire. He moved without speaking, sliding the bag of the supplies onto the counter and removing his apron. His jaw was tight, not with anger, but with a kind of old restraint. He crossed the floor slowly, as if walking through fog. The three young men had gone quiet, but not humble. Their eyes still darted, amused, like they'd only half registered what they'd started. Gordon stopped just short of their table. "Everything okay here?" he asked, his voice calm but flat. Jake leaned back in his chair again, arms crossed. "We're fine," he said. "Just talking to the gentleman over there. Didn't mean to cause drama." Gordon didn't smile. Talking or testing? The others exchanged glances. One of them shrugged, but Jake held the line. "We were just wondering," Jake said, "if he actually served, or if he just, liked the look." There was a pause that felt too long. Gordon studied Jake the way a carpenter studies a crooked board, calculating where it might split if pressed too hard. "I've known Frank for 15 years, Gordon said. "You've been here 15 minutes. Jake lifted his eyebrows. "So that's supposed to mean he's untouchable?" "No," Gordon replied. "It means you don't know what the hell you're talking about." The table next to them went still. A woman in scrubs, halfway through her muffin, pushed her plate aside. Gordon took a half step closer, but he didn't raise his voice. "Frank Delaney served 3 tours in Vietnam, Hue, Khe Sanh, and Da Nang. He lost half his platoon in '68 and came home with his lungs burned out from chemical fires. He didn't ask for a parade. He asked for black coffee and a quiet window." Jake scoffed. "That sounds rehearsed." Gordon's mouth twitched. "It is, because I've had to explain it more than once." One of Jake's friends shifted in his seat, muttering, "Man, just let it go." But Jake wasn't done. He leaned forward, lowering his voice like it was just between him and Gordon. "You ever think maybe guys like him just cling to stories because they've got nothing else?" Gordon didn't blink. But something in his stance changed, like a man remembering the taste of a name he hadn't spoken in years. "I used to think that," he said, "until I held my dad's discharge papers in one hand and his folded flag in the other." The words weren't loud, but they landed hard. Jake didn't have a comeback for that. Gordon turned toward Frank's table. "You okay, sir?" he asked. Frank hadn't moved. He was still staring out the window, his coffee cooling beside him. Then slowly, he stood. The motion was stiff but steady. He reached for his cap, picked it up, and turned around. Frank didn't look at Gordon. He looked at Jake. "You want stories," he said. "I've got plenty, but most of them end in silence and blood, and none of them are for you." Jake opened his mouth to speak, but found nothing there. Frank continued, voice low but deliberate. Wearing this hat doesn't make me a hero. It reminds me I'm alive when better men aren't. His hand went to the insignia again, thumb resting just below the eagle. Mock the hat all you want, he said, but don't you ever mock the dead. A barista at the far end of the counter froze mid-pour. Someone near the door let out a breath they didn't realize they'd been holding. Jake swallowed. We didn't mean you did, Gordon cut in. You just thought no one would call you on it. For the first time, Jake looked unsure. Look, we didn't touch him. We didn't threaten anyone. Gordon nodded once. No, but you walked into someone else's piece and tried to knock it over. Silence returned. This time, it wasn't passive. It had weight. Then a man in the back corner, dressed in a county utilities jacket, said clearly, He's right. Time to go. Jake's friend stood up without argument. The second followed. Head down. Jake hesitated, then rose slowly. His expression had turned unreadable. He looked at Gordon, then at Frank, then back at the other customers. Finally, and he muttered, Whatever, and turned for the door. No one said goodbye. No one told them to come back. When the bell chimed behind them, it didn't sound cheerful. It sounded final. Gordon exhaled and looked at the room. No one moved. He didn't ask them to. He turned to Frank. Sorry about that. Frank just shook his head. Nothing new. You shouldn't have to get used to it. I'm not used to it, Frank replied. I'm just tired of being surprised. Gordon nodded. You want a refill? Frank didn't answer immediately. Then he said, Only if you're pouring. Gordon gave a short laugh and headed for the counter. He didn't say anything more to the crowd, didn't give a speech or ask for applause. That wasn't the point. At the bar, he reached for a clean mug, then paused. He looked down at the row of cups, hands still for a moment. Then he grabbed a permanent marker from beneath the register. He wrote one word on the bottom of the cup before filling it with coffee. Then he walked it back to Frank, who took it without a word. Gordon didn't sit, didn't hover, just placed a hand briefly on Frank's shoulder and went back to work. Across the cafe, conversation slowly restarted. The clink of plates resumed, but the tone had changed. There was no music playing, but still something quiet hummed between the tables. Not awkwardness, not guilt, awareness. Frank took a sip, then noticed the word written beneath the rim. Honor. He didn't smile, but his hands steadied, and the coffee stayed warm in his grip. The cafe returned to its quiet hum, but something in the air had shifted. The background sounds resumed, coffee being poured, cups clinking, the soft hiss of steam, but every noise now felt more deliberate, more aware. Even the regulars seemed to stir slower, their eyes occasionally drifting back to the corner window. Frank remained seated for a few minutes, his back slightly hunched, one hand resting on the table near his cap. Then, with effort, he reached down, pulled the cap into his lap, and slowly began to rise. His knees crackled as he stood, and one hand instinctively went to the small of his back. He placed the cap on his head with a practiced motion, the brim low, angled just enough to shade his eyes. But as he turned toward the door, Gordon stepped forward and gently blocked his path. Without a word, Gordon set a fresh cup of black coffee down on the table Frank had just left. The mug was clean, ceramic, no logo, just hot, dark, and waiting. Frank paused. You didn't have to do that, he said quietly. It's not on the house, Gordon replied with a faint smile. It's mine. Frank's face didn't change much, but his shoulders eased just a little. Then he shook his head. I don't need it. Gordon didn't move. Frank added, softer now. I'm used to leaving before people start whispering again. For a moment, Gordon said nothing. Then he gestured to the stool across from the corner table and sat down, his elbows resting on his knees. When I was 16, Gordon said, I was riding a bus home from school. My dad was sitting near the front. He had this lapel pin Army infantry, real small, Didn't say a word the whole ride. Frank listened, still standing. A man got on, younger guy, saw the pin, started mouthing off something about baby killers, oil wars, the usual. Nobody said a thing, not the driver, not the other passengers. Gordon looked down at the floor, as if the story were still happening. My dad didn't respond. He just took the pin off, put it in his pocket. I didn't say a damn word either, just stared out the window. Frank's expression didn't shift, but his eyes settled on Gordon's face. The cafe around them moved on in quiet motion, but the corner of the room had gone still. I didn't talk to him for 3 days, Gordon said. I felt ashamed, like I failed him and didn't even know how to say it. 30 years later, I still remember the silence more than anything else. He straightened up. I couldn't go back and fix that moment, but I could stand up today. Frank nodded once, not out of agreement, but acknowledgement. A few seconds passed. Then, from the far end of the room, a couple in their 70s approached. The man wore a light windbreaker with a subtle Marine Corps patch sewn near the cuff. The woman had silver hair tied back neatly, and she carried a folded card in her hand. She placed it on the table without saying much. The card was soft blue, with the words, "Thank you," pressed in gold foil. My husband served in Da Nang, she said gently. He was there in '69. Said the worst part wasn't the fire, it was the silence after. You reminded us both what dignity looks like. Frank glanced down at the card but didn't touch it. The older man stepped forward, extended his hand, and Frank took it briefly, firmly. They left without another word, and the card stayed on the table. Moments later, a girl maybe 7 or 8 years old tiptoed from behind the counter. She wore a green apron several sizes too big, clearly borrowed from someone on staff. Her hair was tied into a messy ponytail, and in her hand she held a crayon drawing of a dove with big, uneven wings. She placed the drawing beside the thank you card, looked up at Frank, and said shyly, "I see you every morning. You always smile at the birds. You're nice." Frank's lips twitched slightly. "Do you like birds?" he asked. The girl nodded hard. "They come to the planter outside. You bring crumbs sometimes. I saw..." Frank glanced at the barista behind the counter young woman, probably the girl's aunt or older sister, who gave a sheepish shrug, mouthing. She insisted. Frank kneeled, slowly and carefully, until he was eye level with the girl. "Thank you for the drawing," he said. "It's the first dove I've seen today." She smiled wide, then scampered back behind the counter. Gordon approached again and leaned one elbow on the back of a nearby chair. "Sometimes I think this world forgets how to thank the right people," he murmured. Frank replied, "Most days I prefer they forget. It's easier." Gordon raised an eyebrow. "You don't believe that?" Frank considered that. Then he pulled off his cap and looked at the emblem resting in his hand. "This hat doesn't belong to me," he said. "Not really. Every time I wear it, I carry men who didn't get to come back. People think it's pride, but mostly, it's grief." He looked toward the window again. The sunlight had moved, catching the dust in the air like glitter. "I only kept it because no one else asked me to." Gordon didn't say anything this time. He just stood beside him, steady as a wall. Frank straightened and took one last sip of the coffee Gordon had brought him. Then he gathered the drawing, the card, and his cap into a careful bundle and turned toward the door. He walked slower this time, but not because of age. The weight in his steps had changed. It wasn't regret, it was recognition. Every table he passed was quiet, but not out of fear or awkwardness. It was something else. Respect not demanded, but earned. As Frank reached the threshold, the bell above the door jingled gently. He didn't look back, and no one dared look away. Outside, the sky had softened. A few birds pecked at the sidewalk planter, oblivious to the world. Inside, the dove drawing still sat on the table, colors vibrant under the afternoon light. And in the silence that followed, no one reached for their phone. The next morning arrived like any other quiet, brisk and lined with golden Arizona light. The streets outside Reyes Coffee House were still damp with condensation, steam rising off warm asphalt as the sun climbed. Inside, the cafe was already coming to life. The grinder whirred, orders called out in familiar voices. And yet, the regulars seemed to glance every few seconds. At the corner table near the window, it was empty. For a while, then, just past 8. The bell above the door jingled, soft and familiar. Frank Delaney walked in same posture, same cap in hand. He paused at the threshold only a moment, then made his way to his usual seat, the same one he'd chosen for years without anyone noticing. Now, they noticed. He set the cap down gently and eased into the chair. The chair creaked, like it had missed his weight. He folded his hands, resting them on the table, and waited. He didn't order. He didn't need to. From behind the counter, Gordon had already begun pouring. Frank stared out the window, watching a pair of birds dart past the planter outside. The same ones. Maybe, or maybe not. But they circled and landed and pecked with the same gentle urgency as always. Gordon walked over and set the mug down without speaking. Frank glanced up. Their eyes met briefly. Gordon offered a quiet nod and then turned back to the counter. A few minutes later, he hung a new sign on the wall behind the register. The letters were hand-printed. Black marker on whiteboard, Kuchin Bin, 50% Café, Kong Kangai 2, Chung Toi Tin Tong. Beneath the message, someone had doodled a tiny coffee cup with steam curling upward, shaped like a folded American flag. Nobody clapped. Nobody took a photo. But people saw it. One man behind his laptop looked up and then down again, typing slower. A mother waiting for her latte reached over and gently took her daughter's hand. A delivery guy tipped his cap toward the counter, as if thanking the sign itself. Frank took a sip from the mug. It was hot, strong, unapologetically bitter. He smiled. It was faint, more of a breath than a movement, but it was there. A few minutes passed, and the door chimed again. A young man in a button-up and tie stepped in, briefcase over one shoulder. He looked around awkwardly before approaching the counter. He spoke quietly to the barista, pointing once toward Frank's table. The barista nodded and handed him a second mug. He walked over, careful not to spill. Frank didn't look up until the man was beside him. "Mind if I sit?" Frank looked him over. He was young, late 20s, maybe, hair neatly combed, sleeves rolled just enough to show a small army patch tattooed near his elbow. The man hesitated. "I don't know if I should say this, but yesterday, what you said, that meant something." Frank gestured to the seat. The man sat. They drank quietly for a moment. Then the young man spoke again. "My dad was in Fallujah. Never talked much about it. When I joined, he said one thing. Listen to the old guys, the quiet ones. I guess I'm trying." Frank looked at him for a long moment, then reached up and removed the cap from his head. He turned it in his hands once, then slowly pulled off the small metal USMC insignia clipped to the side. He didn't hand it over. He set it on the table, gently, deliberately. "This," he said, "isn't to impress anyone. It's not a badge. It's a reminder." The young man looked at it, then back at Frank, of what Frank's voice was low, of the ones who didn't get to grow old. Outside the window, the morning light had shifted. The sun now hit the table directly, casting a soft glow across the silver badge and the worn surface it sat on. Neither man moved to touch it. Across the room, Gordon noticed the interaction. He didn't interrupt, just leaned against the counter, polishing a glass that didn't need polishing, watching with the kind of attention you reserve for rare things. One of the baristas passed by, tray in hand, but slowed as she caught sight of the two men in the corner. She didn't stop, but her eyes lingered for a moment. Another customer, seated at the communal table by the door, reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded paper napkin. He wrote something on it, just a few words, then stood, walked over, and placed it on Frank's table. He didn't say a word. Frank opened the note after the man left. It read, "My brother never made it home. Thank you for carrying him with you." Frank folded the napkin once, then again. He didn't smile, but his hand rested on the note a little longer than it needed to. The young man beside him cleared his throat. "Do you still talk to any of them?" "Your unit," Frank didn't respond right away. He reached over, took the USMC insignia, and set it back down beside his coffee. "I don't need to," he said. "They're still with me." The room didn't quiet because it already was. And in that silence, something settled. People returned to their routines, but nothing returned to the way it had been. The corner table wasn't just a table anymore. It was something else now. A place of gravity. Frank stayed a while longer. Long enough to finish his coffee. Long enough for the light to change again. When he stood to leave, he left the insignia on the table. The young man looked at it but didn't reach for it. He understood. Frank stepped outside into the bright morning. Sunlight bouncing off the sidewalk, off windows, off the small patch of metal still sitting in the corner of Rhea's coffee house. And inside, as the cafe returned to its rhythm, no one said his name aloud, but everyone knew it. And no one questioned the seat by the window again.